Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Uspaman Lamhlongo, the Senior Programs Officer at the Democracy Development Program, and I will be moderating today's engagement. And welcome to our a series of conversations that we're going to be having in relation to the local government elections. And of course, our session today is held in partnership with the Mail and Guardian, and we thank them again for their continued investment in creating spaces for public engagement. On behalf of the Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program, Dr. Paul Kariuki, the board, as well as our core donor, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the South African office. We'd like to thank them for their participation, but also to welcome you to today's engagement. Our engagement today will take the space of convening around what is the social political landscape ahead of the municipal elections. And part of our brief has been that complexity has indeed been increased with the latest development within the Constitutional Court and the Independent Electoral Commission as it pertains to the local government elections 2021. We've seen across the past couple of months COVID-19 having wrought a number of challenges for citizens who are already experiencing heightened inequity, unemployment, and poverty. While municipalities embody the sphere of government closest to the people and whose work has a larger impact and influence over citizens' daily lives than the national and provincial government, each day municipalities must make tough decisions about driving economic growth in towns, building and maintaining infrastructure, and providing essential everyday services that residents depend on. This election is then, as with every election, presents voters with important choices. And we have an obligation as a Democracy Development Program, as well as other civil society organizations, to assist in creating the opportunity to wade through all of the noise and to assist citizens in with availing the right levels of information in order for them to make the best decisions for their communities. We have with us 3 guest speakers that will be helping us to interrogate the various subject matter. And among the guest speakers, we have Ms. Bonolo Magale, who is the program manager for the Center for Human Rights at the Center for Human Rights. And she'll be speaking to us specifically around in instances where we have to make decisions about which parties to vote for and what impact that has on the powers that those parties have in the councils in which they're going to serve. And this presents itself in areas such as the potential formations of coalitions. As we saw in the previous 2016 elections, some major municipalities had been brought into a space where they would have to have had those coalitions happen. Partially, we can speak to the Joburg Metropolitan Municipality, and then of course we have the Nelson Mandela Bay Municipality, which were key in helping us to come to an understanding of what potentially a South African compromise would look like when it comes to those types of coalitions. We also have with us political writer and commentator, Mr. Andile Zulu, who from his perspective will also be giving us his analysis of the socio-political landscape, helping us understand what's at play for voters, what's at play for political parties, and potentially giving us an idea of what he might foresee to be the key decision makers for people turning up or not turning up to the polls. And then, of course, we also have Mr. Khanya Vilakazi, who is a lecturer at the Political Science Department at the University of Mpumalanga. He also, in his own right, is a researcher and political commentator. And he'll also be speaking similarly to what Andile will be speaking to, and helping us look at what data and analysis is available to help inform what decisions citizens will likely be taking. We do invite you to send us as many questions that you may have on the chat section in the session itself. We'll also be at different stages in our webinar today, launching polls that we would like you to also participate in. The webinar is also being streamed on YouTube, so if you do have some difficulty with this link. You can find us on the YouTube page of the Mail and Guardian, where this is also being streamed live. And you may also continue to invite other individuals or share the link with other individuals who might not have made it, but you think this conversation will be vital for their participation as well. For the first part of the conversation, we'll be speaking primarily to Ms. Bonolo Makgale, but before we go ahead, let's allow her the opportunity to give us her initial input into the subject matter, because I think it's important that we sort of flip the conversation around a bit. Where in this specific part of it, we're looking at what the potential results are likely to be, thinking about what it means for political parties to campaign, not to win necessarily, but to be key role players when it comes to the negotiation space, about who leads and who governs in the space of municipalities, particularly as it relates to coalitions and what they mean for the way in which people receive services. So when they call themselves kingmakers, because they potentially have the ability to launch one political party over another into a space where they become leaders and so forth. So, Ms. Makgale, thank you very much for joining us and making time. We would like then to allow you the initial input, and then I'll prepare some questions on the side so that we can engage you further.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Spamandla, for the invitation. I do want to apologize for the noise behind me. I am at the airport and it's a bit loud here. My sincere apologies. As Spamandla has mentioned, my name is Bonolo Makgale, and I am a program manager of the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. I've been asked to reflect on coalition governments because I think we can agree that coalitions are going to be part of our political landscape for a long time. And so just to reflect briefly on what happened in 2016, the 2016 local government elections were a turning point for South African politics. This moment dramatically changed the political landscape of a country that had one party, the African National Congress, with a complete electoral dominance and power. The ANC's post-liberation electoral dominance was then threatened with the trend of the ANC's misgovernance and all sorts of allegations of corruption. And so, as Spamandla alluded earlier, the ANC lost the country's capital city, Tshwane. It lost the country's economic hub, Johannesburg, and it lost Nelson Mandela in Port Elizabeth, and only managed to maintain power in eThekwini, while we saw the DA retaining its electoral dominance in the city of Johannesburg, in the city of Cape Town. Now, in the face of what can be termed as open sesame moment for opposition parties, coalition governments were constituted in the wake of the 2016 local government elections results. Now, the thing about coalition governments is that they are a difficult art to master. They require political parties to create an administrative and a political climate of stability to govern. And while this is a reality, and of course, generally, if you think about general theories around coalition governments on a global scale, they are considered to be unstable. But while they are considered to be unstable, they've got this incredible capacity to develop very robust democracies, to develop very robust institutions, and also just an opportunity to create collaborative governance and power sharing. And so now, I think it's important then when we think about the upcoming local government elections, to think about the rationale behind the formation of these coalition governments. And I figured that one way of doing that, and to help us as we reflect on what power sharing would look like, what balancing power would look like, as I said earlier, that by the look of things, coalition governments are going to be with us for a long time. I briefly want to reflect on the 3 municipalities that I've mentioned earlier, and how they came about and formed this quote-unquote new form of government. So the question is, was it to bring greater administration and political cohesion, or was it an attempt to gain executive power? And I think it is very clear that for all 3, power seeking dominated policy seeking. However, there were nuances in the balance of power centric and policy centric agenda. The rationale for all of them was to unseat the ANC with the hope that, you know, they will gain majority power to be able to advance their intended policies as articulated as it was articulated in the election manifesto. But what we saw come up quite soon was ideological differences. We saw policy divergence, and we saw a very strong absence of willingness of political parties to compromise, and this was an indication of competitive power play. What we saw that the rationale to unseat the ANC proved to have bound these parties superficially, because when it was time for them to, you know, to compromise, when it was time for them to manage what we call this marriage of convenience, it proved to have been very unsustainable. Now, as we prepare for the upcoming local government elections, I think one of the lessons that we can draw from these previous coalitions is that one would be the whole idea that, and this was the case for both City of Johannesburg and Tshwane, the lack of preparedness. The lack of preparedness became glaring, given that there was no formal and comprehensive coalition agreement to codify basic policy principles that members will adopt. Of course, with the assumption that such an agreement would have been adhered to. And I just want to make a reflection on what happened in Nigeria post the 2019 elections. There was a coalition that was formed. They called it the Coalition of United Political Parties. It was interesting that with this coalition in particular, they had a coalition agreement, but having the coalition agreement didn't change anything, because this coalition was short-lived. And therefore, if it happens that there are coalition governments that are formed on municipal levels, again, I think what will be important is not only do these parties come together and develop, you know, formal and comprehensive agreements, but also there's a need for legal binding framing, legal binding mechanisms that will ensure that the coalitions are governed well. Because the agreement in itself, as it is proved in Nigeria, for example, that the agreement was not effective because the coalition arrangement in Nigeria collapsed very soon. So I think what we may need to consider within the South African context is to think about developing, you know, legal binding mechanisms that will help in how the coalitions are governed. But also, I think this is something that political parties can consider as well, institutionalizing these arrangements, because as we saw it from the 2016 formations, the parties came together, they agreed that they wanted to unseat the ANC, and then and then there was one party, for example, like in Johannesburg, the DA was technically the leading party there, but this was not institutionalized. So I think we need to think about institutionalizing coalitions, and after institutionalizing them, or while we institutionalize them, we need to think about, you know, developing very strong legal mechanisms that will guide how the coalitions are governed. And number two would be, I think it is evident that unless alliances are better coordinated ideologically and in terms of power objective, endemic power struggle will result. So there's a need for clear collaborative governance and power sharing system. And we saw that in the three municipalities that I mentioned earlier, there wasn't a very clear collaborative governance and power sharing system. So if we think about the future, political parties may need to really think deeply and critically on how it would look like, and again, develop even you know, binding guiding principles on what this collaborative governance and power sharing would look like. But also political parties will need to compromise on some of their policies for the sake of coalitions. I mean, if we think about what happened in the city of Johannesburg, for an example, ideological battles had an impact on service delivery. We saw the DA policy, which is essentially free market orientated, was presented as the antithesis of the EFF's hardline socialist orientated policies. So despite, for example, the DA had made commitments to provide comprehensive housing delivery, given that the city of Johannesburg has this massive backlog on housing. And then we had the EFF that was provoking mass land grabs and occupation. On the one hand, the DA was saying people must not occupy the land illegally. On the other hand, the EFF was saying, well, if you don't have a place to stay, occupy the land. And because of this ideological and ideological differences and policy divergence, we saw that this ultimately hampered service delivery. But I must add, though, that with again, I keep making an example with the city of Johannesburg because that's the municipality that I've studied in the past 3 years. What we saw there that was surprising, and this is something that maybe in the future we can learn from, was a compromise between Herman Mashaba, the center-right former mayor of the city of Johannesburg, and the EFF caucus, where Herman Mashaba seemed he seemed to have been on the side of the EFF, and I suppose it's because Mashaba understood very well who owned the power behind the throne, given that EFF was that queen maker role. If they were to withdraw their vote, the coalition government was going to collapse. And so it was interesting to see how Mashaba was able to navigate this very complex space that he found himself in. And of course, it caused trouble for him. He landed in hot waters with his party. You will remember during, I think it was in 2019, during the Alexandra shutdown, when there was, Mashaba made a commitment to Alexandra citizens that he's going to rebuild the informal structures that the Red Ants had abolished because the DA had taken that matter to court around land grabs. And Mashaba went and publicly said to citizens of Alexandra that he's going to rebuild the structures that the Red Ants in Johannesburg had demolished. And ultimately, essentially what he was doing, he was going against what his own party stood for. But he did that because he was prioritizing the coalition arrangement and prioritizing the city. So I think one of the things that if we are to think about the future of coalition government in South Africa and ensuring that they're sustainable, given that in their nature they are unstable, I think political parties really need to think hard in how they could compromise on some of their policies for service delivery, because ultimately we want to ensure that South African citizens are provided for and given the basic needs that our Bill of Rights state, right? And so if there are these conflicts within municipal level among these political parties that are governing, what it does is that it is the citizens that suffer. And I remember a few weeks ago, I was in a similar conversation around coalition government, and I asked a question that have this new arrangement, a new form of governance, has it changed? Has it increased, or rather has it improved service delivery in South Africa? Has it reduced corruption in South Africa? And if the answer is no, which I think we can agree that the answer is indeed no for some municipalities, that we still had service delivery issues, we still had corruption issues. What then do we do moving forward? Because ultimately we can play these politicking games, but if they aren't changing the lives of South Africans, then what are we doing? And lastly, I think one of the things that we can take as we think about the future and as we think about balancing power is, and I don't know how this would look like more pragmatically, but I think we need to separate between the politics of local government and the administrative running of municipalities. I think that politicians must do the politics, and the administrative municipal bodies must focus on service delivery, because what we then saw was a strong influence of political parties in how municipalities are administered, which then again hampered service delivery. So perhaps this is something that we could collectively collectively think about that. What would it look like if politicians stick to the politics and administrative bodies and stick to the administration of municipalities? Because ultimately, we want to ensure that South African citizens are cared for. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is an exciting moment for us as a country, that we have an opportunity here to develop and forge a new form of governance that speaks to power sharing and collaboration. And just think about what will that look like if as collective political parties come together, relinquish their own political ideologies and policy differences. You can just imagine what will that look like. So I'm going to end there, Spamandla. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonolo, for that initial input. Once again, just an apology for the quality of the visuals and perhaps sound, and it is on our side. For the first speaker, as we've indicated, she is unfortunately on her way to another engagement in Zimbabwe. But for the purposes of our discussion, I think we've been able to have some good insights from her. Bonolo, if I could just give you a couple of questions in relation to what you've just spoken about. And I think the last part that you spoke about specifically was going to be of interest to me, around the work then of officials at municipal level. To what extent are they reliant on the sort of direction of the political figureheads or the individuals that we elect into governance? Because ultimately the core work of service delivery has to continue in one way or the other, regardless of whether we have coalition power sharing agreements or we have a single dominant. Is the issue in our politics that there's such a significant sort of impact on the administrative part of the work of governing, from a sort of power and political sort of impact perspective? So that's the one part of the question. Is that an issue? To what extent can we rely on officials to continue to do their work, even in sort of the sort of absence of clarity, political clarity, as it were? Because one of the things that were very significant about the nature of some of those municipalities is the fact that, for instance, a political party like the Economic Freedom Fighters and the Democratic Alliance would find it difficult to meet in the middle because of the necessarily divergent views on the ideologically and how this country ought to be governed and their vision for this country. To what extent then do we rely on them to make those ultimate decisions? Then the other part was around sort of the idea of kingmakers. And this is an interesting one because in national elections, for instance, there's a lot of campaigning or decampaigning of smaller parties by the more established political parties. They say to us that you shouldn't necessarily be casting your vote for one of the smaller parties because you are essentially wasting your vote. But it seems quite significant in the instance where we have the space or potential for the creation of a coalition government. We saw, I think in the last day or so, the results from the German elections, a country that has a significant experience insofar as hosting coalition governments, where Angela Merkel's political party lost, whilst it's not a huge margin of loss, but they lost their center-left opposition. And it means now there's a race to forming a coalition government. Who leads that coalition government in those instances? And whilst it might have bigger implications for them because it's a national election, as it were, but for us at municipal level, it's also quite significant because that's the space at which citizens interact with government the most, or at least that's a space at which they feel more empowered to interact with government. And that's one other part of my question to you. And then lastly, when you talk about better coordination and the idea of written agreements, when should these discussions be happening? I feel to some extent we do leave it too late because ultimately everyone wants to create the impression that they are running to win, they're not running to lose. And is that a realistic perspective, particularly in a space where there's been such a duration of single party dominance at national, provincial and local government? there's a sense of lethargy from citizens to vote for a different political party. It could be even in the Western Cape, for instance, where there are citizens who complain about the 15-year reign of the Democratic Alliance in some part, but they are unwilling to change their vote because rather the devil you know, as it were. And in the same case within the African National Congress across the country. That's been that sort of difficulty. So that 5 minutes response to those three sort of very heavy and layered questions. You don't have to answer all of them. We do have our other individuals in the room, Andile as well as Kanya, who will also give us some insights. Of course, I do invite our participants to also share some questions. We've noted Freeman Benguka Gama's question. We'll put that question to Kanya and Andile instead. Thank you, Bonolo.
Thank you, Spamandla. I will start with your last question because I remember it. I wasn't able to make it. I think what happened in 2016, I think political parties were caught off guard, or rather the ANC was caught off guard, given that they owned the electoral dominance for so long, right? And so when the election results were then announced, and that there was no party that had the 50 plus number of votes that was required. In that moment, political parties quickly came together and said, "Oh, okay, something must be done," and that's the lack of preparedness I referred to earlier. So if anything, I'm hoping that at this point, political parties are having conversations. I do know, and I say this with authority, that the ANC in Johannesburg and Tshwane have actually been meeting with other political parties that speaks the same language as them, they call it the same messaging, because they realized that they were not prepared in 2016, and I think because, and this is why those coalitions did not work out well, because there was no preparation before the election. They came together in a panic when the results were announced, and they gather in one room and they were like, "Oops, anyway, we've got one enemy. We agree, we don't like the ANC, let's get rid of the ANC." And they thought that common goal of getting rid of the ANC was enough for them, and it wasn't. It has proved to have not been. So I'm hoping that political parties are already having conversations now, because we do know that there may not be a party that comes out with the 50 plus number of votes that are required. And what that helps then is that it gives them time to prepare. It gives them time to draft these agreements. It gives them time to draft them, the coalition governance structures and system that I spoke about. And so then when the elections are announced, they then just convene and officialize this thing. So I think it's important that they have the conversations prior to the election. And then on question 2, because I'm a feminist, I will use the term queen maker. You can use your kingmaker, it's all good. One of the things that I think are fascinating about coalition governments, and I mentioned that in my initial remarks, that it creates space for collaborative governance and power sharing. What it does is that it creates space for parties that ideally would not be able to govern. And we've seen this. There's a lot of literature around this across the globe. We saw this in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, where even in India, Mexico, where literally smaller parties that were too small and no one was voting for, suddenly there's an opportunity for them to govern. Even in the city of Johannesburg, we saw smaller parties coming in to form part of coalition. So I think it helps with balancing power dynamics and just ensuring that one party doesn't dominate and own the space. So I think I think that the role of queen makers, it's important, but also too much power into queen makers can collapse coalition governments. And we saw what the EFF did in the city of Johannesburg, because ultimately the collapse of the coalition government in Johannesburg municipality was part of it was the policy and ideological differences that I mentioned, but also it was the role of the EFF. when I was doing my master's, I interviewed councillors within the city of Johannesburg, and I promise you, all the councillors of all the political parties said the same thing, that the power that the EFF had was the ultimate collapse of that arrangement. And then I don't remember your first question. Please remind me of your first question.
Sorry, I was just asking around the administrative role players. So the officials at municipal level, shouldn't they be doing their work regardless of who's politically in power? And why is there such a significant impact around sort of the political leadership of that space?
Unfortunately, in an ideal world, there should be separation of power, but that wasn't. So again, in Johannesburg, for an example, so the ANC was governing that municipality, then the DA came in, and apparently administratively it was problematic, because most of the officials that were in the city of Johannesburg were members of the African National Congress, right? And that's what I said. I don't know what will that look like in terms of municipal arrangement, administrative arrangement, and so on and so forth. But I think we really need to think hard and critically about drawing that line, the political line and the administrative line. But also on a political level, decisions, budgetary decisions on how they prioritize service delivery, that's done on a political line. And if good decisions are not made there, then administratively nothing can be done. If us as political parties aren't agreeing, for example, if one party feels that the priority is to develop hostels, right? And that was the case for the IFP in Johannesburg. Their priority was to develop hostels. The priority for the EFF was the land question and whatnot. The DA claimed that it wanted to provide housing. And so on political level, they were not agreeing on the service provision priorities. And if there's no agreement on that level, then administratively nothing can be done, right? And I don't know, and maybe this is something that I could leave with the audience here or my colleagues who are part of this conversation to help us think about that what will then look like to ensure that the politicking does not hamper service delivery, and the decisions that are being made on a political level do not delay what happens on administrative level. I mean, I know on administrative level as well, the DA was claiming that the ANC cut their budgets because obviously if you think about intergovernmental relations, the ANC decides on national level and provincial level and then provides, they do budgetary allocation on local government level. So the DA was accusing the ANC of cutting down their budget because they knew that if they don't cut down their budget, the DA could do what it had promised to do and it would make them look good, right? And so there's also these intergovernmental relations at play here where the National Party makes decisions and budgets and then all of those needs to translate to what happens on the ground. And so, yeah, while this creates a space for, like I said, while it creates a space to open up space for other parties, open up space for robust democracies and institutions. The administrative part of it really needs to be, we need to pay strong attention to that because ultimately that's where the service delivery will come from.
Thank you so much once again, Bonolo, for your input and insights. I think we just need to campaign right now for the center to give you access to one of these lounges at some point, so that we don't have a similar issue. But yeah, thank you so much. We wish you well on your trip, and yeah, you can catch the rest of as with our attendees, you can catch the rest of the engagement on YouTube. It will be posted on the Maiden Guardian YouTube page. And just to give you feedback on our first poll that we launched whilst Ms. Makhale was speaking, asking the question of what do you think of the available manifestos? We are aware that some of the big municipalities in the past week have launched their manifestos, and an overwhelming majority of respondents are saying that they think that the manifestos themselves seem to be a recycling of the usual campaign points. And this is an interesting perspective, particularly because when we look at one of the challenges with political organizations campaigning at local government level, it would appear that some of the campaign points are related to what might not necessarily be the competence of their local government counterparts. And there needs to be some work in investigating how we can start doing the necessary civic education to the extent that politicians don't feel empowered to make broad statements that don't necessarily directly relate to what your ward councillor can do for you, and things that are not necessarily the competency of those individuals. But of course, as part of that conversation, then I'd like to bring on our next two speakers. Let's start with Andile Zulu to give us his unpacking of what sort of the political landscape looks like in our country as we head up to vote in these next elections. What is at play for most citizens? What is at play for the political parties? And what are the risks that we need to take in order to ensure that we advance necessary sort of democratic change that we'd like to see in the various spaces in which we engage? Of course, he'll be having another 10 minutes in order to engage. We have launched our second poll, which speaks to what do you think will be the turnout for the local government elections on 1st November will be. The first option is higher than previous local government elections, lower than previous local government elections, unchanged, or you are unsure. Andile, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to the Mail and Guardian, the DDP, for bringing us together to have this very important discussion. So what I'm going to be trying to do from my perspective is to look at the landscape on the local level from the perspective of ordinary citizens. And it might seem pessimistic initially, but I just want to give an honest reflection of what ordinary people might feel. And I think we have to start from a position of acknowledging that there is widespread discontent and there is widespread indifference to politics amongst most South Africans. So in other words, what we've witnessed is citizens slowly becoming spectators in their own democracy. So in other words, people feel as if they have been excluded from engaging in political power at a local level. And people feel as if even if they were to engage, they aren't able to actually change things for the better. And I think we have to recognize that this is a global phenomenon that has been going on for the past 10 years roundabout. It's this type of indifference and the sense of not being able to change politics on the local level, I think, is what led to the ascension of people like Trump. It is what led to the ascension of people like Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's what led to Hindu nationalism in India. So what you have abroad are these figures who are able to promise radical reforms and change, a drastic divergence from the present, because ordinary people feel as if they have no impact on the world around them. So I first want to assess why people feel as if politics is in some ways useless to them, why they feel as if they are merely standing on the sidelines, and then also to look at how political parties in these elections are trying to respond to the landscape and to respond to the sense that people aren't able to change things. So we first have to understand that the sense that people are powerless, that people have no impact on politics, creates rage and apathy, which are both unproductive forces within politics. And we saw this type of rage during the recent unrest in KZN and in Gauteng in July. Many people who watched the mass rioting and the protests and the looting and the destruction of commercial property were wondering to themselves how people could participate in this destruction and have no concern for the long-lasting effects. But you have to remember that people were willing to do this because for so long, they've been excluded from being able to participate in the prosperity that a small amount of South Africans have. And they've been excluded from being able to get the well-being that people have in terms of quality education, in terms of good healthcare, in terms of sustainable, long-lasting, well-paying jobs. And so people were willing to engage in the destruction, for example, of a mall, because they are not able to often get the luxury items and the goods in that mall. They don't know people within their communities who are always employed in those malls. So that destruction is in some ways meaningless to some people because they've been on the outside for so long. So the type of rage that we saw in July can happen again because it springs from the sense that people are powerless to change things within their communities and in their provinces and on the national level. And the apathy then creates another problem where people are unwilling to engage in local politics because they feel it won't change anything. And then that allows politicians, like Bonolo and Brian have suggested, it allows politicians to make grand promises. It allows politicians to be very vague and general about their policy points. So then we need to understand what are the primary causes of this sense of apathy and the sense of being powerless as spectators in the democracy. And it applies on a national level and on a local level. I think we first have to acknowledge that because we are, I think as of last week, have the highest unemployment rates in the world. We are the most unequal society in the world. We have half of the population, I think it's 55.5% living in poverty. Now that means there are 55.5% living on 600 to 1,300 Rand a month. So for most South Africans, day to day is a struggle for survival. It is a struggle to find a job. It is a struggle to keep a job. It is a struggle to try and sustain yourself in employment that is not satisfying, that does not pay well, that does not offer you benefits that can allow you to access education for your family and children, to be able to access healthcare and other goods for your family and for your children. And so most people, I think, are drained by daily existence in the country because when they go out into their communities, they're also confronted by the decay of infrastructure. They're confronted by insecurity in terms of not feeling safe on a day-to-day basis. And they're also confronted by a myriad of social issues. So women are confronted, for example, by the terror of gender-based violence, specifically the terror of male violence from their partners, from their colleagues, from their family members. And so people return home after a long day of trying to survive, and they have no interest in what happens within local governments, even more so within national governments, because they're trying to merely live day by day by day. And we also have, on a sociological level, I think we need to understand that this exhaustion from trying to survive on a day-to-day basis means that people then turn to other platforms to find satisfaction and to find relief. And often it can be through entertainment, it can be through drug use, it can be through alcoholism. I think in our political analysis, we don't do enough inspection as to how ordinary people are trying to cope on a day-to-day basis through other means that might not be productive in the long term. But also what we've seen since 1994 is an attempt by the national government to suppress grassroots organizations which challenge the predominant order. So if you talk to members of Abahlali baseMjondolo here in KZN, if you talk to members who are fighting for housing, who are fighting against evictions, who are trying to secure better food security, if you talk to the Amadiba Crisis Committee, what you see is that they face constant harassment and violence from the state because they are a challenge to the predominant powers. And so the fear of harassment and the fear of violence and the persecution of leaders of certain grassroots movements means that many people, especially from working class communities, are disincentivized from engaging within politics, or they don't see alternatives through civic participation. And we also need to understand, I think, as Brian previously mentioned, that another factor which really contributes to the sense that people are spectators in democracy is the lack of civic education. in terms of ordinary South Africans understanding what are the extents of local municipal power, what are the constitutional duties of municipalities, and what are their abilities to engage with those local powers. So there has been almost a total lack of constantly trying to educate ordinary South Africans as to their rights and their obligations and how they can engage within politics. So the combination of an economy that makes people struggle to survive, alongside a national government that suppresses grassroots mobilization, combined with the lack of civic education, means that most people don't want to engage in politics. However, I think that we're beginning to reach a changing point with the decline of the ANC. So as Bonolo already mentioned, the 2016 municipal elections were the beginning of the decline of the ANC, primarily because of, for two reasons primarily. Number one, the ANC had failed since 1994 to transform the economy in terms of housing and food, in terms of labor relations, in terms of policing and healthcare. So in terms of housing, food, and labor relations, the ANC failed to change an economy which excludes people from meaningfully accessing those necessities. Many of those goods are still very much privatized. And then on the other hand, because of state capture, which was a collusion between the state and the private sector, using local power and provincial and national power to accumulate resources, the state's capacity to deliver was drastically withered away. And that has contributed to the perception that politics is useless because the state is never able or rarely able to deliver. And when it does deliver, the quality of those services is very questionable. If you look at the stats in terms of sanitation, we have increased the amount of South Africans who have access to water, but whether that water is clean and how consistent that access is often the problem. So just to end off, that decline of the ANC since 2016, and even before that, in fact, since 2012, I would argue, has, however, created space for other political parties, primarily the DA and the EFF. So the question we should ask ourselves is, how do these parties seek to present themselves in the imagination of citizens? Many of them are running on delivering efficient quality services, but we've heard that talk before, right? It doesn't sound different to what the ANC has promised for the past 27 years. But later on, if there are questions, we can dive into the ideological presentation of the DA, the EFF, and I think Action SA is going to be a significant player in November. But that's it from me so far.
Thank you very much, Andile, for that initial input. I'm going to allow Khanya to come in, and then we'll go back to yourselves and Khanya after Kanya's presentation for sort of an in-depth discussion around what this all means. Of course, Khanya, perhaps your discussion can also sort of key us into, is it necessarily a failure just of the sort of the individuals that we elect, or is there something fundamental about the institutions and the way that they're set up and legislated and so forth in the course of our democratic endeavor that makes it difficult, one, for the right type of, the right quality of services to be delivered in a way that's equitable? Because in some municipalities, there's service delivery, but it's good service delivery for some, but not for all. What does that mean for the way in which we transfer that equitable power and sort of delivering the necessary resources to the individuals? And then to what extent can party political decisions shift the way in which these institutions themselves are set up primarily? Because in some respects, some people are arguing that it's not necessarily a failure of the political party, but it's a failure of the institutions, and how do we reform those institutions? As you would remember, there's a discussion currently that's happening around electoral reform and what that means. You don't have to start with what I'm asking you right now. I'm just saying, maybe as part of a presentation later on, to consider those aspects. Over to you.
No, thank you to the DDP and to the Mail and Guardian for just giving us this platform to share our view in the national dialogue in terms of the upcoming local government elections. But Brian, I think fundamentally, I'll start with your point. Fundamentally, the issue has always been that there's no shift within the South African landscape politically in terms of equating services from certain areas because of our historical past. And I hate dwelling on our historical past because it seems as if we're lingering on 28 years after our independence. But fundamentally, what has always happened is regardless of the color or the creed, services have always been given to those that are of a higher income level. And in South Africa, those people are predominantly white, and therefore the system in itself was designed to protect those individuals in certain areas. So what we have seen in the past 28 years is a shift of Black South Africans in the middle class moving into such areas, and because they are now constituting a higher population in these areas, now these areas are well taken care of. However, where they emanate from, I myself as a lumpen Polaterate reside in a township. I can see the difference between where I grew up in this township and where I could potentially live as a lumpen, as a worker within the South African economy. So I can see how unequal service delivery is, and that's the main issue that South Africans at a nucleus level are dealing with. But to shed light on today's discussion, it's to first just cascade in terms of how much is the voter going to be looking at when deciding to vote under such social political situations. And I don't want to go far into a decade, to what people have termed the 9 wasted years or the decade of looting, but I just want to look at the end of what people have termed the decade of looting. What has happened? So you can look at the fact that from 2018, when President Cyril Ramaphosa took over, he had this grand ambition. And this grand ambition was to uplift South Africans from the bootstraps, wanting South Africans to do their duty as citizens in order to improve our country. Terms such as Thuma Mina came through the national fold. However, we never, as society, interrogated what Thuma Mina ideologically means and what Thuma Mina actually means to the voter as compared what it means to politicians and to public representatives. So this grand plan was to make sure that he had enough funding within the national economy to actually improve services, create jobs, and other fertile ground that was going to alleviate so many social political issues. So he had this $100 billion target that he had set for himself in order to get foreign direct investments for South Africa to prosper. Did that happen? That is yet to be discussed. That is yet to be determined. And from that point onwards, the level of unemployment exacerbated. It grew exponentially, and more importantly, youth unemployment skyrocketed. And to top it all off, with the COVID-19 pandemic, so many systemic issues then came to the national fold. For example, when lockdowns happened, people lost their jobs, and these jobs weren't high-paying jobs. These were jobs of the lower middle class or lower class in society, such as your waiters, such as hotel staff. All of these services and jobs that require being on site had to close because of national lockdowns. So when that happened, it exacerbated the unemployment of people that have minimal level skill to operate from home. Some of us were lucky enough to even have jobs during the pandemic because we could work from home, and it was easy for us to do our jobs through the internet. But now this is a problem that nobody had planned for. So now the voter was sitting at home under lockdown, recently lost their job, and they needed some sort of reprieve. And this reprieve came in the form of social relief by the government for unemployed people and an increase in social benefits for people that were currently within the social agencies. Now, the issue then became who was going to fund this and how was this going to be funded. So when President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about accessing 500 billion worth of loans in order to combat COVID, everybody knew or took it to the chin that this was an unprecedented thing, and by accessing this 500 billion, we were going to be fighting COVID, making sure that hospitals got their PPE, that there were enough ventilators, and that when the opportunity comes, people will get vaccinated. However, corruption then knocked on the door. So when corruption knocked at the door, we saw certain things happening, which the citizens of South Africa had led to believe were things that were forgotten in the past 9 years. And in this current government and current dispensation, it was a totally different ballgame. And I am not specifically going at the ANC, but I'm going at government. And there needs to be a separation between the two, between the ANC and government, because the buck only starts and stops with people that are elected, and these people are unfortunately the governing party and its government at the end of the day. So when last year, when there was an uproar on PPE corruption, this is when even the moderate South African that had hoped that Cyril Ramaphosa would have come with a totally different atmosphere in governance and in government and in public financing was extremely hard done. And the reason why they were hard done was because evidence starting to trickle out that the same money that was supposed to be helping people that were under lockdown, had lost their jobs, was then being siphoned out by certain people. And these people, and I think I need to pivot back to what you were speaking to with Bonolo about who is actually to be held accountable. Is it the public representatives, or is it the people, the public service workers in municipalities and in departments? That's when you get to see. That's when we got to see that there's some form of coordination between people working within a municipality, within a department, with certain politicians, because it emanated through the Special Investigation Units, SIU, that politicians were then influencing certain decisions that were taken by people that were employed at a certain level, and everybody got kickbacks. And this increased the level of distrust for a lot of South Africans. Afrobarometer released a survey that about 49% of its participants for the survey had thought that corruption in the past 3 years had actually increased instead of decreasing. And this speaks to the fact that people are now at a local level seeing the impact seeing the impact of corruption and how this impact is actually affecting them and their bottom line and their means of survival. Makeba spoke about this need of about 55% of South Africans to just basically survive, not thrive, but just survive. And against all that, they have to witness all the levels of corruption that are occurring in our state, the manner in which nobody actually gets held accountable for it. And in the midst of this, the voter has been sitting at home watching the Zondo Commission continuing. And as it continued, it started to unravel so many things about how government actually operates and how government and the public sector have come together to actually funnel money out of state coffers into their own individual pockets. Speaking about such things, one would have believed that within President Cyril Ramaphosa's own administration, we wouldn't have found people such as Ukhusile Diko being suspended or the former Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, resigning before the SIU and resigning because of PPE corruption allegations. So all of this is a culmination of what the voter is facing when coming to the local government election. And at a very large and national level, there is a sense of voter apathy. And this voter apathy stems from literally feeling disenfranchised by the system and everything else being against you in terms of trying to survive in a world where surviving is the only thing most South Africans can do. So this voter apathy turned out in large numbers from what Makeba has said since 2012, 2016, and again in 2019, there's been a steady decline in terms of participation. In the 2019 elections, you saw about 66%, if I'm not mistaken, of voters actually voting instead of the whole total number of about 26 million of registered voters. Now, 33% or 30% of the voting population decided not to vote. And this is because of two ideological differences in which our politics has played out in the past 28 years. It's voting, and it's through voting behavior, because this voting behavior is between two ideological points: party identification and policy-based identification. A lot of voters identify with certain political parties because of what they've promised them, of what they represent. However, they identify themselves with them. However, these political parties then fall short of being the perfect political party that can actually deliver what exactly they're saying. And on the other hand, you've got political parties or voters that look at political parties as parties that have the perfect policy. However, these parties do not represent who they are as a people and how that will translate in the general public. So now we are seeing that the voter is going to be going to the local government elections with all of these things in their mind. What exacerbates it the most is the fact that when political parties launch the election campaign, it's at a national level. And our previous speakers spoke about the fact that it might not translate. I think Uspa spoke about that. It might not translate. A person living in Ingutu, Ward 2 of Ingutu municipality, cannot understand why a person perhaps living in Cape Town might have the same issues. Somebody living in Cape Town might have an issue of inconsistent Wi-Fi in the city center, while they might be trying to just even get a road built. So now all of these things are done at a national level, where you find national leaders portraying a manifesto of the party instead of the party itself going down to grassroots level and having individual manifestos delivered at a ward level, where voters at a ward level can actually see and look at what potential good an individual or a political party can bring to the fold when they go and vote. But because now politics is about merely obtaining power and not about changing the lives of the people, we have seen that this translates to how many votes can you get, how many people can you get on committees, and how can you drive the direction of the party in this way in this municipality. And it's no longer about delivering the services to the people at a grassroots level. And now this is the issue that most voters face on a daily basis. That I, as myself, I need to go to a counselor that is half the time he's not there, but if he is there, I am unable to access certain things. And when they deliver the manifesto, they make these overreaching promises that they are not even in line with their ability at a municipal level, but they will, however, make this. And when they make this, we want to believe it because we have been pulverized by these things that have been happening in our circumstances, that dreaming of a bigger, better life seems possible because the person making that promise, we have termed as people that can actually deliver on those promises that they have made. And I think I should just cut it there and just wait for the questions.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Kanya, for that input. I'll invite both yourself and Andile to just keep your cameras on as we're going to start engaging with the questions that are in our chat box. For our colleagues who have joined us, I think we are now on our third poll. The second poll results were out. And the question to that poll was, what do you think the turnout will likely be? And of course, there's a sense that the turnout will likely be quite significantly lower than previous elections, with the second sort of rate or second percentage of responses saying that it's likely to be higher. So there's a bit of tension there. But of course, the overwhelming majority is saying that we will likely experience quite low turnout in the upcoming election. And I think it was an interesting response, specifically in relation to how both of you have analyzed the sense of disenfranchisement that citizens themselves are facing at different levels in the way in which they're governing. Kanya, you make an interesting point, and I was just thinking, hey, if people gave us money to be their political strategists, just 5 years to develop a political strategy, and some of the work that's been done for political parties, unfortunately, is over-reliance on the party brand as opposed to the sort of the type of brand that speaks to the type of service delivery, especially at a local level. It boggles the mind why you would have the head of a political party being on the poster of a local government election poster when that position is not necessarily being canvassed for by that individual. Yes, he's recognizable. Yes, this is a way to catch people's imagination and minds, but what is the election? What are we meant to be casting our vote for? And that becomes a difficult thing. We can't all we're not voting for the son of the soil. When I vote in my ward, in Ward 15, in eThekwini, I'm not voting for CR17 when I'm voting in my ward, Elindelan. So clearly, there's a disjuncture between what politicians want us to be speaking to and what they actually are trying to canvass for. Let me go through the questions now. The first one that I had mentioned that we had noted was the one from Freeman Bengogakam, and I wanted to perhaps both of you can have an opportunity to respond to this before we go to the next range of questions, because they're quite similar in nature. And one of the things that are significant, I think you had spoken about it, Andile, around Action SA being a significant player in this specific election, particularly in the Gauteng environment, in the different municipalities in Gauteng. Freeman says The Put South Africans First movement is well represented in these elections. Parties like Action SA, One Movement South Africa, One South Africa Movement, Patriotic Alliance, South Africa First, ATM, and NSA are all sort of speaking around these issues, and they are part of that movement. What are some of your views about the issue of immigration? And of course, from our perspectives, we're not being asked as to what is immigration, why should we care, that sort of thing. But what are the likely implications for the ways in which local government conducts itself? In the time of Mashaba's reign, Mashaba's mayorship, for instance, we saw a lot of red ants moving in the Johannesburg CBD, getting rid of what they termed to be illegal immigrants and so forth from different spaces. There was a sense that some of that targeting was also for around sort of traders, informal traders, and what that looks like then for the space for encouraging local economic development. So there's a multitude of issues. It's around sort of revitalizing the urban environment for cities in particular, for metropolitan municipalities, and then what are our thoughts on the sort of drive for people to come into the urban environment, and then of course the last one around sort of the sense of social cohesion at a very local level. How can we drive that forward, particularly when this issue is such a significant one for the different political parties? Since Kanya's just spoken, let me give him a slightly bit of a rest. We'll start him with on the next couple of questions. Andile, what are your thoughts on this one?
I'm sorry, could you just ask one of the questions again? The signal cut off in the...
Essentially, Freeman says, Put South Africans First movement is well represented in these elections. What are some of your thoughts on the issue of immigration? And now is highlighting that perhaps we can look at it from the perspective of what's needed insofar as development and the revitalization of cities, how local governments interact with informal traders as a step for local economic development, and then on the third level, the idea of social cohesion. So beyond, so there's real tensions racially in this country. There's a real tensions when it comes to the class stratification in this country. But then there's a third fold. Of course, there are other issues, gender-based violence and sort of harming of LGBTQI community. But one of the other sort of big identity points that people sort of campaign around is illegal immigration or migration in and of itself. What are your thoughts on this and its impact or its potential impact on these next coming elections?
No, it's an important and urgent question. I think the anxieties and the anger in regards to the issue of illegal immigration, from my perspective, primarily starts as an economic issue. So, and you see this trend around the world where you have mass immigration. So you have a situation where a lot of developing countries are experiencing economic instability and precarity. There's even a scholar, Zygmunt Bauman, who calls it liquid modernity, where people are no longer able to access the basic necessities of life on a consistent basis. However, there is a mass influx of immigrants who are a source of often of cheap labor for big business and for industries and even for local industries and communities. And so private entities are often more willing to employ immigrants who are desperate, who are in a much rougher situation, who are willing to work for less benefits and for longer times, etc. And so people compare, so like you could call your native citizens, compare their economic precarity to what they see as the slow economic success of migrants, and that often breeds resentment. So I'm of the perspective that, yes, we do have a xenophobia problem in terms of our perceptions of our brothers and sisters on the continent, but it primarily stems from economic anxiety. And so there have to be interventions which, first of all, deal with this economic precarity that citizens are facing. So I think you have to introduce interventions which deal with the minimum wage, for example. You have to introduce interventions which decommodify access to food which is a big issue in terms of the hunger that is increasing across the country. And you have to also improve access to housing so that when people feel secure in their economic position, they are less likely to look at others as competitors and to look at others with resentment. But on the second level then of illegal immigration and just the migrant community in our local communities, there has to be more steps within local government to properly integrate migrants into the economy. The biggest issue that we have is illegal immigrants struggling to survive because there aren't proper methods to provide them with skills, to provide them with secure housing, and to integrate them into the communities. And so people often have to find ulterior ways to survive. And that can often breed resentment amongst other citizens. What worries me about some political parties that speak from the position of patriotism for the country, if we're being very honest, is that it isn't a patriotism that is about collectively benefiting, but it's a patriotism that is based on chauvinism, on creating differences between us and them, which is ultimately unproductive. Because the bigger picture is there is an incredible amount of mass immigration that is going to continue happening in the next decade because of climate change, because of political instability. Immigration is a reality of the 21st century. And so the challenge governments have to face on the ground in local communities and at the national level is to say, how can we create a pie that everyone is able to eat from, that everyone is able to prosper from? Because this strategy of emphasizing patriotism for us native citizens, even though we're a collection of people created by a settler state, so the idea of like a native South African is very questionable to me. So like the idea of patriotism as us versus them is often just a strategy to manipulate people's fears and anxieties in order to get votes. And then what often happens on a local ground is you see the harassment of migrants from police and even within the healthcare industry. I know many people from Zim, from Mozambique, who struggle to get healthcare because of their illegal immigrant status, who struggle to get housing because of their status as illegal, aliens. So there has to be an attempt to integrate people into the economy. And just lastly, I think on social cohesion, it's valuable to recognize that many South Africans see the wrong enemy, if we're being very honest, right? The people who are jeopardizing our ability to prosper as a country are not migrants, are not queer individuals. It's often individuals with political and economic power who have no interest beyond their own noses and beyond their own prosperity. Many people complain about the ANC's inability to transform the economy. But if you look at the legislation and the policies the ANC tried to introduce from the Zuma term onward, often people within the private sector, especially mining and agriculture, were willing to fight against those reforms, which might have benefited working class citizens in terms of redistributing wealth and giving some ownership to vital resources within the state. So for me, our primary antagonists are not ordinary people. They're often people with political and economic power who want to reserve it for themselves. And if we allow ourselves to be distracted by people who may come from different places, who may live different lives, we're all going to end up drowning.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Kanya. Andy left with that. I was just thinking, Kanya, if perhaps we could park your thoughts in relation to that so that you can have an opportunity to respond to some of the other questions in our chat box as well, just so that we are aware of time as well in relation to this. So there's a comment that came from sort of Jackie Smith, for instance, around some of our discussions, saying that some of our discussions are great, but essentially the solutions that we talk about are long-term. Citizens can't necessarily keep paying or suffering for trial and error And that's speaking related to the coalition discussions that were being talked about earlier. Jenica Bierkes had also stated that even in cases where there had been coalition agreements, these agreements were vague and far removed from the needs that are specific to municipalities. Their lack of experience in formulating these agreements also creates unequal bargaining advantages in favor of senior, and by senior either in terms of numbers, but also in terms of being established. Perhaps let's consider these two questions from Ms. Ella Gandhi as well as Jenica Bierkes. The first is there a need for parties and civil servants to place people first, work for what is in the best interest of the people at large? The issue of political hegemony should be placed on hold and not be used in order to allow parties to fail. This is perhaps a problem in poor service delivery continuing. That's one consideration that you might consider responding to, Kanya. And then the next question from Jenica Bierkes. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names and surnames. What do you think about the effectiveness of current public participation mechanisms? For instance, is there a linkage between the functioning of these mechanisms and the motives of the public to instead take their frustrations to the streets? Those both are interesting questions, particularly in light of what we saw in July, but not just in July, in the past we can say even 20 years, the nature and the rate at which service delivery protests have happened have been growing year on year, but also the tensions at local level have been uprising, even in the instance when we saw issues of foreign migrant sentiments then being termed xenophobic violence and so forth. So perhaps there is a question around the current public participation mechanisms. Are they sufficient? Are the fact that they are not or maybe sufficient linked to why we end up going to the streets and end up not voting? Kanya?
Okay, I'll be very brief because I'm mindful of the time. First and foremost, let's look at the public participation mechanism that we currently follow. Whenever municipalities want to implement things, it is always it is always from the municipal level going down to its citizens. So I've always had this issue of the top-down approach, which is predominant within our local government. I've always said that if the public themselves do not raise a common consensus of their needs, then the municipal councillor has nothing to hold whilst going to council to say, in this particular communities, these are our issues. So what tends to happen is the minute somebody gets elected, they now become the municipal spokesperson to their constituents. So the roles are reversed. Instead of being the messenger of your constituents, you then become the preacher to your constituents in terms of the direction. So fundamentally, I think the public participation mechanism currently in place should change. And it should fundamentally change in the sense of an issue-based ballot. An issue-based ballot is when, upon voting for a particular municipal ward councillor and PR seats, you then have a list of things that are required at a ward level. So these will then become a manifesto emanating from the voting public on their needs. So this becomes a rubric in which a state councillor could be checked upon in terms of, have you delivered to us what we had asked for when we voted in these past elections? So that's the fundamental change and shift that I would be willing to advocate for, because I foresee it as being something very radical, but something worth pursuing. When the second question, I think the first question was speaking about the trial and error of coalition agreements. I think we need to understand that this was one of the first, in 2016, was one of the first times where we saw a fundamental shift, a political political shift of parties coming together to form coalitions on the basis of a common enemy. Now, the issue of forming an alliance on the basis of a common enemy is that services are not rendered because not everybody sees service delivery in the same manner. Ubonoro spoke about the three different forms of housing that in the Johannesburg Metro wanted to be implemented. The IFP wanted hostels, the EFF wanted land to be occupied, while the DA wanted to just give housings to people that qualify. Now, all of these people are speaking about the same thing, but the tones are totally different. So these become a learning curve for future coalitions. And we ought to give coalitions a try as South Africans because we have no other alternative. Because in any municipality, nothing gets done without a 50% plus one, and it's adopted in council. So if you don't have the numbers, you can have 10 councillors advocating for something, but if you have 11 councillors that are not willing to buy or to budge in the point of view, nothing could get done, even though this will be pertaining to service delivery. So we now need to look at what are these public representatives representing at a municipal level. Are they representing the interest of their individual wards, or are they representing the interests of the political parties in which they occupy their seats with? Now, the minute you start speaking along those terms, you then get to see how different how indifferences resemble within a local government sphere between voters and the political parties representing them at a municipal level.
Those are really interesting perspectives from you both. What I would then want to try and speak to as the next question from Mr. Khuluse, Sthembiso Khuluse, as well as maybe a comment from Ella Gandhi to close us off as part of this session. Sthembiso Khuluse says, I have noticed that this time, the civil society organizations are sending candidates from communities to stand for the local government election. And given the increased number of independent candidates emerging, could this change the voting culture, especially in local government elections? If not now, maybe in the future. And then maybe lastly, the commentary would be, in the atmosphere in some communities in KwaZulu-Natal is still tense politically. And with the lack of voter education in communities, do we think this might contribute to political intolerance? And in KwaZulu-Natal in particular, this is a significant question. We've already had intra-party violence and resulting in death from people who are contesting ward candidate positions for this upcoming election. To what extent is this likely to influence then the broader electoral cycle in that regard? If you both could consider responding to those two questions. And then just a final question from Ella Gandhi, not a question, a comment from Ella Gandhi, speaking to a strong civil society can help, in her view, to ensure that services are delivered effectively, corruption is halted, and citizens' rights are respected. Cool. Thank you so much for that, for those contributions and for those chats. I'll announce the results of the final poll after your final inputs, Kanya and Andile. Either of you, whoever feels moved to speak, can go for it.
Okay, let me just be brief. And I'll be speaking on the issue of community-based organizations sending through their candidates. I think most political parties will have a very hard time contesting ward spaces with community-based organizations, because they're literally doing the work in which political parties ought to be doing out of election cycles. And they're much more known, much more visible in the community, and results of which are seen throughout the community. So it becomes much more easier voting for people that you have seen and that have done work in the community. I'll pass on the next question to Martha.
I agree. I think the future of our democracy in the next 5 years or so is going to rest on reawakening public participation in politics, primarily through civic and community organizations. So, you know, if you look at a lot of the independent candidates, they're often young people who have been working on issues of food security, on issues of sanitation, and on issues of safety and housing. So I think there needs to be some total return to what we used to have in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, where there was constant public participation and conscientization of ordinary people to engage within politics, as Ukanya said, working from the ground up and forcing consensus onto our local government. I think when people forget about the power that you have in numbers, if you're able to start a campaign of occupation, for example, or start a campaign of peaceful protest, and if you're able to wage that campaign for 6 months and have leverage against politicians or private entities, you will be able to get significant gains. I think in Germany recently, or in Belgium, they were able to decommodify housing. They were able to put pressure on landlords to open up housing for citizens. But obviously it happened through a long amount of time. So I think there needs to be the beginning of a series of campaigns at local levels and provincial levels, which essentially gather together to hold leverage against politicians in order for them to get the services that they deserve.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for both of you for your contributions in this session, as well as to Bonolo for her contributions, and to our attendees in the chat section for your contribution and questions. I think this is a very important part of our work as civil society and yourselves as commentators, academics, and contributors in the political arena of our country to say, let's find spaces and find opportunities to dialogue and discourse about these sorts of things, in the hope that at least if we are not ourselves passing on some nuggets of knowledge, that we are at least also learning and passing it on to other segments of networks and communities that we are a part of. We really appreciate the partnership from the Mail and Guardian. We appreciate the continued support from our core donor, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, as well as the support from our Executive Director, Dr. Paul Kariuki, as well as the board of the Democracy Development Program and its staff. We look forward to further engaging you in other parts of our arenas. Of course, we thank our speakers for their time and insights in today's engagement. This webinar will be available on the Mail and Guardian YouTube page. You're welcome to share, relook at it, use it for just making potential input into what your likely vote will be in future. And of course, we do look forward to seeing you in the different spaces that we'll be convening. Part of the work that DUDP, for instance, is convening around is an observer mission that's been a long part of our work as an organization. And we want to ensure that the integrity of the electoral process is intact, and that we can at least say that people can be confident that the result of the election is the result that people voted for. If people choose not to vote, then of course that has implications on the legitimacy of the government of the time. And you have to ask yourself, if for 5 years you want to be governed by an organization that doesn't have the necessary legitimacy, if you want to be governed by the minority of people that are part of your ward, of your municipality, and potentially even of your province and country, we look forward to seeing what the results thereof will be, and of course to a safe, free and fair election. Thank you very much for everyone for having been with us today.